The morning of the auction, there were 30 horses nobody wanted. They stood in the back pens behind the Mercer County stockyard, sorted away from the good stock the way a grocer sorts bruised fruit from the rest, and the men leaning on the rail outside their pen had already made up their minds about each one. A bay mare with a scar that ran the length of her shoulder. A black gelding who pinned his ears at anything that moved. A roan with one blue eye and a habit of striking the fence when a stranger came near. 2 yearlings who had never been handled. A draft cross so tall and so spooky that the auctioneer had quietly suggested he be sold by the pound rather than the head. They were the leftovers of 3 estate sales, 2 divorces, and 1 bankrupt training operation up near Bristol, and they had all ended up in the same dusty corner of the same gravel lot on the same hot Saturday in April, because no one with sense had bid on them anywhere else. The killer buyer from Tennessee was already there with his trailer backed up to the loading chute, smoking a cigarette down to the filter, waiting for the formality of the auction to release the horses into his custody at 60 cents a pound. He had done the math on the drive over. He was not in a hurry. And then a girl walked up to the pen. She was 23 years old, 5'4", wearing jeans that had been washed too many times and a canvas jacket that had belonged to someone larger. Her name was Wren Halloran, and she had driven down from a hollow in the eastern part of the county in a 1994 Ford that ran on stubbornness and a prayer her grandmother had attached to the visor in 1998. She did not look at the men at the rail. She looked at the horses. She looked at them for a long time, longer than was comfortable for the men watching her, long enough that one of them, a big-shouldered cattleman named Harlan Boyd, who owned more grass than anyone for 2 counties, finally said loud enough for the whole row to hear, "You planning to buy yourself a problem there, sweetheart, or you just window shopping?" Wren did not turn her head. She said, "I'm counting." Harlan laughed, and the men around him laughed because Harlan had laughed, and the killer buyer flicked his cigarette into the gravel and ground it out with his heel, because none of this was any of his concern. When the auctioneer finally got to the back pens an hour later and offered the 30 head as a single lot to clear the yard, Wren raised one finger. The bid was $800 for all of them. Nobody bid against her. Harlan Boyd laughed again, harder this time, and said, "Well, congratulations, honey. You just bought yourself 30 ways to go broke." The auctioneer's gavel came down. The killer buyer got back in his truck and drove south with an empty trailer for the first time in 9 months, and Wren Halloran wrote out a check on an account her grandmother had opened for her the week she turned 18 and walked back to her own trailer to figure out how she was going to get 30 horses home. If this story is already pulling at you, do me a small favor and tap that like button. And down in the comments, tell me the name of the town or the city you're watching from, because I read every single one, and I want to know where in the world this story is landing tonight. Now, let's get back to it. Wren had not gone to the auction with a plan to buy 30 horses. She had gone with a plan to buy 2, maybe 3. The quiet one she could halter without help, and she had brought enough cash for that and a small cushion besides. What changed her mind was something she could not have explained to Harlan Boyd or to anyone else at the rail, because the explanation lived in a place she did not have words for yet. She had stood at that pen and watched those 30 animals for almost an hour, and somewhere in the middle of that hour, she had understood something that the men around her had missed entirely. She had understood that the horses in that pen were not bad horses. They were horses who had been asked the wrong questions by people in a hurry. The bay mare with the shoulder scar flinched when a hand came toward her head, but not toward her flank, which meant someone had hit her in the face, probably with a lead rope, probably more than once. The black gelding pinned his ears at movement, but his eyes stayed soft, which meant he was bracing for something he expected, and not threatening something he intended. The roan with the blue eye struck the fence when strangers approached, but did not strike when Wren stood still, which meant the roan had learned that stillness was safer than motion in human company. The 2 yearlings had never been handled because nobody had bothered, not because they were unhandleable. The draft cross was spooky because he was tall enough to see things other horses could not, and nobody had ever taken the time to walk him past those things slowly. Wren had grown up watching her grandfather do exactly that kind of walking, slowly, past things, for hours, with horses other people had given up on, and she had spent the last 6 years of his life standing at fence lines with him, learning to see what he saw. He had been dead 2 years now. The farm had been hers for 18 months, and she had stood at that pen and counted 30 horses that, to her eye, were not broken in any way that patience could not mend. Getting them home took 4 days and 3 borrowed trailers, and the help of a 17-year-old neighbor named Cole, who did not ask questions because he had been raised not to. They moved the calmest ones first, in pairs, down the 2-lane that ran through the gap in the ridge and up the gravel road that climbed to the Halloran place. The farm sat on 180 acres of mostly hillside, with one long bottom of decent pasture along the creek, and the rest of it rough, wooded, broken up by limestone outcrops and old fence lines that had not been maintained since her grandfather's last good summer. The house was small and white and tired. The barn was large and gray, and in a way that mattered, sound. Her grandfather had built it himself. In 1971, out of oak he had cut on the property, and beams he had pegged rather than nailed, because he did not trust nails to outlive him, and it had not. The roof did not leak. The stalls were the old wide kind, 12 by 14, built for working stock with room to lie down. There were 16 stalls inside and a long shed row of 8 more along the south wall, and behind the barn there were 4 small paddocks fenced in woven wire that her grandfather had set posts for in a pattern she had never fully understood until she walked it again with 30 horses in mind. By the 4th night, every horse from the auction stood on Halloran ground. They were thin, they were wary. Several of them were lame in ways that would need months. None of them, when she walked among them in the last blue light of the evening, looked at her the way they had looked at the men at the rail. Her grandmother lived in a smaller house at the bottom of the lane, a quarter-mile from the barn, and her name was Ada, and she was 81 years old, and she had not weighed more than 105 pounds at any point in the last 30 years. Ada wore men's work pants and a flannel shirt and a wool vest from October to April, without apology, because she had earned the right to dress for the weather rather than for anyone's idea of an old woman. She came up the lane on the morning of the 5th day in the small electric cart her son had bought her 2 Christmases before she had told him she did not need it, and she sat in the cart at the gate of the largest paddock and looked at the horses for a long time without saying anything. Wren stood beside her. Finally, Ada said, "Your grandfather would have started with the roan." Wren said, "I know." Ada said, "He would have started with the roan because the roan is the one who is the most afraid. And the most afraid is the one who will teach the others fastest once she stops being afraid." Wren said, "I know." Ada said, "All right then." And she turned the cart around and drove back down the lane and did not come up to the barn again for 11 days, which was her way of saying she trusted the work to the worker. The work in the beginning did not look like work to anyone who drove by. It looked like a young woman standing in a paddock doing nothing. She stood in the roan's paddock for 2 hours the first morning without moving, not looking at the roan directly, holding a halter in her left hand and a soft rope in her right, and waiting for the roan to come to her, which the roan did not. She stood there again for 2 hours the second morning, and again the third. On the 4th morning, the roan walked to within 10 feet of her and stopped. On the 7th morning, the roan put her nose against Wren's shoulder for 1 second and then walked away. On the 11th morning, Wren slid the halter on the roan in the middle of the paddock, and the roan did not strike and did not pull back, and Wren took the halter off again immediately and walked out of the paddock and did not return until the afternoon. By then she had already begun the same slow approach with the bay mare and the black gelding in their own paddocks on either side, so that all 3 horses were learning at the same time, in parallel, and all 3 were watching each other learn. Harlan Boyd drove past the bottom of the lane on the 2nd Sunday in May, on his way back from church, and saw her standing in the middle of a paddock, doing what looked, from the road like absolutely nothing, and he laughed all the way home and told his wife that the Halloran girl had paid $800 to stand in a field with 30 lawn ornaments. His wife, who had known Ada Halloran for 50 years, did not laugh. She said, "Give it time, Harlan." Harlan said, "Time is the one thing she has, and the one thing those horses don't, because every day she stands there is a day she's feeding 30 mouths on 180 acres of rock." His wife said, "Give it time anyway." Harlan said, "I'll give it till the first hard frost." That is what he said. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It turned out, in a way he would not understand for almost 2 years, to be a prediction of something else entirely. By the end of May, Wren could halter 12 of the 30 horses without difficulty, and could lead 9 of those 12 out of their paddocks and down the lane to the bottom pasture and back. By the middle of June, she had begun ground driving the black gelding in long lines in the round pen her grandfather had built out of split locust in 1983, and the gelding, who had pinned his ears at every human within sight of the stockyard, walked and trotted and stopped on a soft voice cue within 3 weeks. By the first week of July, the draft cross had walked past the mailbox, the trash cans at the road, the rusted-out hay rake at the corner of the lower field, and the laundry line behind the house without spooking at any of them, because Wren had walked him past each of those things 40 times before asking him to do it without stopping. She kept a notebook in the breast pocket of her jacket, and she wrote in it every evening at the kitchen table by the light of a single lamp, 1 page per horse, in pencil, in handwriting so small and so even that Ada, who came up to the house on Sundays for supper, said it looked like her grandfather's. Wren said, "I learned it from him." Ada said, "I know you did." The notebook recorded what each horse had done that day, what each horse had refused, what each horse had offered without being asked, and what each horse seemed to be telling her about what had been done to it before it had arrived. The bay mare with the shoulder scar, Wren rode on the 3rd week of July, has begun to lower her head into the halter rather than raise it away. The roan, she rode on the 4th week, came to the gate when called for the first time. The black gelding, she rode on the 1st day of August, stood ground-tied for 11 minutes while I mended the fence behind him, and did not move when the wire snapped and struck the post beside his hock. She underlined that last entry twice. The fence had snapped because the staples were old. She had not thought anything of it at the time. She would think about it later. The first sale came in the middle of August, and it was not a sale Wren had gone looking for. A woman named Eliza Crane, who ran a small therapeutic riding program over in the next county for children with anxiety disorders, had heard from someone at the feed store that the Halloran girl had a black gelding who would stand still through anything, and Eliza Crane had driven up the gravel road on a Tuesday morning unannounced because that was how she did most things. She watched Wren work the gelding in the round pen for 40 minutes without saying a word, and then she said, "What do you want for him?" Wren said, "I wasn't planning to sell him yet." Eliza said, "I'll pay you $4,000 for him today, and I'll bring the trailer back this afternoon." Wren looked at the gelding for a long time. The gelding looked back at her with the same soft eye he had shown at the stockyard, the eye that had told her in April that he was bracing for something he expected and not threatening something he intended. She said, "He's worth 6. Eliza said, "I know he is. I'm offering 4 because that's what I have today, and I'll owe you 2 on the 1st of October, and I always pay what I owe." Wren said, "All right." The gelding left in Eliza Crane's trailer at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and the check for $4,000 sat on Wren's kitchen table that night under the salt shaker, because she had not yet decided which bill to apply it to first. She wrote in her notebook, 1. She did not write his name. She did not name the horses. She held that line. She almost held that line. There were 2 she would name later, and only 2, and she would have reasons for both. But for the rest of them, she kept to numbers and descriptions, because her grandfather had told her once that a horse you intend to sell is a horse you do not name, and a horse you do not intend to sell is a horse that has already named itself. Eliza Crane paid the remaining $2,000 on the 28th of September, which was 3 days early, and she brought with her on that visit a woman from a hippotherapy clinic outside Asheville who had driven up specifically to look at the bay mare with the shoulder scar. The Asheville woman watched Wren work the mare for an hour and offered $5,000 on the spot and a standing order for any other horse Wren produced who would carry a child with a seizure disorder without flinching. Wren said, "I have 2 more in the barn who might fit you by spring." The Asheville woman said, "I'll wait." She gave Wren her card and drove away with the bay mare in a trailer that was nicer than Wren's truck. That night, Wren sat at the kitchen table and looked at the second check and the card from the Asheville woman and the notebook opened to a fresh page, and she did the arithmetic in pencil in the margin. $800 in. $11,000 out on 2 horses in 5 months, 28 horses still standing in her paddocks and her shed row and her grandfather's oak-beamed barn. She closed the notebook. She did not call anyone. She did not tell Ada, who would find out on Sunday at supper without being told, and who would not make a ceremony of it. She did not drive down to the feed store to say anything to anyone. She put the checks in the drawer with the others, of which there had not previously been any others, and she went to bed. Harlan Boyd heard about the sales in the second week of October from the woman who ran the gas station at the bottom of the gap, who had heard about them from Cole's mother, who had heard about them from Cole, who had been helping Wren load the bay mare, and had been paid in cash for the afternoon. Harlan was leaning on the counter buying a coffee when the woman at the gas station told him, and he set the coffee down slowly and said, "How much?" The woman said, "I heard 5 for the mare and 4 for the gelding." Harlan said, "For those horses." The woman said, "For those horses." Harlan paid for his coffee and walked out to his truck and sat in the driver's seat for a long minute before he started the engine. He drove home the long way, past the bottom of the Halloran Lane, and he slowed down as he passed, but he did not turn in. He could see from the road 6 horses in the lower pasture grazing in the long slanted October light, and he could see that they were standing in a loose group rather than in the tight defensive clusters they had stood in at the stockyard, and he could see, even from that distance, that one of them, a tall draft cross, was lying flat on his side asleep in the grass, which is something a horse only does when it feels entirely safe. Harlan drove home and did not say anything to his wife about what he had seen. He had not yet decided what he thought about it. He had only decided that the prediction he had made in May was not going to come true by the first hard frost, which had arrived 2 nights before, and that he was going to need a new prediction or no prediction at all. October came and went, and then November, and the work continued without ceremony. Wren sold a 3rd horse, one of the yearlings, to a young couple from Knoxville who wanted a project and who had been sent to her by Eliza Crane. She sold a 4th, the roan with the blue eye, to a trail riding outfit in West Virginia whose lead guide had driven 6 hours each way to meet the mare and had cried, quietly and without embarrassment, when the roan had walked up to her at the gate. Wren sold a 5th before Thanksgiving, a 6th 2 weeks into December, and on the morning of the winter solstice she stood in the lower pasture and counted 24 horses still on the place, and understood, in the same wordless way she had understood at the stockyard in April, that she was not going to be able to sell them as fast as she could finish them, because she could only finish a horse properly at the pace the horse allowed, and that meant the operation she was running was going to grow whether she wanted it to or not. She wrote that night in her notebook, in the same small, even hand, "The place will tell me what it wants to be." She underlined nothing. She closed the book. She went to bed. Outside, the wind moved through the bare oaks her grandfather had left, standing along the ridgeline, and inside the barn, the 24 remaining horses stood in their stalls, and in the shed row, and in the deep straw she had laid down that afternoon, and not one of them, that night, was afraid. The second year began the way the first had ended, which is to say quietly. Wren bought no new horses through the whole of January and February because she was not yet ready to take on more, and because the 24 she had were each at a different point in their education, and each required a different kind of attention. She set up a rotation in her notebook that gave every horse at least 30 minutes of focused work 6 days a week, and she rose before light and worked until dark and ate at the kitchen table, standing up more often than sitting down. Cole came up 3 afternoons a week after school and did the mucking and the feeding and the water troughs in exchange for an hourly wage that Wren paid him in cash from the drawer that now contained more cash than the drawer had ever been designed to hold. In the middle of February, a man from a mounted search and rescue unit in northern Georgia drove up the lane and bought the draft cross for $7,000 without negotiation, because his unit had been looking for 2 years for a horse tall enough and steady enough to carry a rider through brush at night in country where a spook could kill both horse and rider. And Wren's draft cross was the first horse he had met in 2 years that he believed could do the job. Wren wrote in her notebook 7. She did not write the draft cross's name because she had not given him one. The Georgia man did. He named the horse on the trailer ride home and sent her a photograph 6 weeks later of the horse standing in a creek at moonlight with a rescuer on his back, and Wren put the photograph in the drawer with the checks because she did not know what else to do with it. By the time the dogwoods came out in the second week of April, exactly 1 year after the auction at the Mercer County stockyard, Wren had sold 11 of the original 30 horses for a total of $53,000, and she had 19 horses still on the place. And she had begun, very quietly, to look at 2 more she had heard about up near Bristol. The same operation, in fact, that had supplied a number of the originals when it had gone bankrupt the year before. Harlan Boyd came up the lane himself on the first Saturday in May, which was almost exactly 1 year to the day from the morning he had laughed at her at the stockyard. He came in his own truck, alone, and he parked at the bottom of the barn lot and got out and stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and waited for Wren to come out of the round pen, which she did after about 10 minutes, because she had seen him drive in, and she had decided to finish what she was doing first. She walked over to him and stopped about 6 feet away and did not say anything. Harlan said, "I owe you an apology." Wren said, "No, you don't." Harlan said, "I do, and I'd like to give it to you so I can stop carrying it around." Wren said, "All right." Harlan said, "I was wrong about those horses, and I was wrong about you, and I have been wrong about both of you in public, and I wanted to come up here and say so to your face before I said it anywhere else." Wren said, "Thank you." Harlan said, "The other thing is, I have a piece of bottom ground down on the river that I am not using, about 40 acres, good grass, good water, no use to me at all this year, because I'm running my cows on the upper place, and I'd like you to have the use of it from now till October at no charge, because I think you're going to need it before the summer is out, and I have it sitting there." Wren looked at him for a long time. She said, "Why?" Harlan said, "Because I was wrong, and because doing it without making a large production out of it is the only way I know how to be useful about it." Wren said, "All right." Harlan said, "All right then," and he got back in his truck and drove down the lane, and that was the entire conversation. He did not make a large production out of it. He never made a large production out of it. He drove past the bottom of the lane every Sunday on his way home from church for the next 2 years, and he never slowed down again because he did not need to. He already knew what was there. The second summer was when the word of mouth became something Wren could no longer pretend was a series of accidents. The Asheville woman had told a colleague at a clinic in Charlotte. The Charlotte clinic had told a private trainer in Lexington. The Lexington trainer had told a writer for a regional horse magazine who drove up to the Halloran place in the 3rd week of June and spent 2 days following Wren around with a notebook of his own and writing down everything she said, which was not much, and everything she did, which was a great deal. The article ran in the September issue under a title Wren did not choose and would not have chosen, and it included a photograph of her standing in the round pen with the last of the original 2 yearlings, now a coming 3-year-old, on a loose rope. The phone in the kitchen, which had not rung more than twice a week for the entire previous year, began to ring 4 and 5 times a day. Wren did not answer most of the calls. She let them go to the machine, and she returned the one she chose to return in the evening. And she did not return more than 2 or 3 a week, because she could not in good conscience sell horses she had not yet finished, and she could not finish them any faster than she could finish them. By the end of September, she had sold every one of the original 30 horses except 2, and she had brought in 14 more from 3 different auctions and 1 private dispersal. And she had begun to use Harlan Boyd's 40 acres of river bottom, and she had hired Cole full-time for the year between high school and whatever he was going to do next, and she had opened a second checking account because the first one had begun to attract questions from the bank. The 2 she did not sell were a small chestnut mare with a kind eye and a crooked blaze, whom she had named Junie because Junie was the only horse who had come up to her at the stockyard on her own and put a nose against her hand before Wren had earned it. And the old buckskin gelding, the oldest of the original 30, whom she had named Mr. Halloran because he reminded her, in the set of his head and the patience of his stance, and the way he watched the younger horses without judgment, of her grandfather. Junie and Mr. Halloran stood together in the small paddock closest to the house, and they were the first horses Wren saw every morning when she stepped out the kitchen door, and they were the last horses she saw every night when she closed the barn. She did not work them. She did not need to. They had nothing left to prove, and she had nothing left to ask of them. Ada came up the lane on the first Sunday of October to look at them, and she stood at the fence and watched them graze for a long time. And then she said, "Your grandfather kept 2 like this at the end." Wren said, "I remember." Ada said, "He said every working farm needed 2 horses who were not working, to remind the rest of them what they were working toward." Wren said, "I remember that too." Ada said, "All right then," and she got back in the cart and went home. It was Ada who, in the 3rd week of October of the 2nd year, came up the lane with something Wren had not seen before, which was a tin box about the size of a loaf of bread, wrapped in a piece of old flour sack balanced on her lap in the cart. She drove the cart all the way up to the kitchen door, which she did not usually do, and she sat in the cart and waited for Wren to come out. Wren came out drying her hands on a dish towel. Ada said, "This was your grandfather's." Wren said, "I know that box." Ada said, "You have not seen what is in it." Wren said, "No." Ada said, "He told me the week before he died to give it to you when you asked the right question, and not before." Wren said, "What was the right question?" Ada said, "You asked it last spring when you bought 30 horses nobody wanted. You did not know you were asking it. He did. He always did. Take the box." Wren took the box. It was heavier than it looked. Ada said, "Do not open it tonight. Open it when you have an hour and a clear head, and read what is written first before you look at what is underneath it." Wren said, "All right." Ada said, "All right then." And she drove back down the lane in the long October light, and the cart was very small against the size of the hill, and Wren stood at the kitchen door holding the tin box for a long time before she carried it inside and set it on the table next to the salt shaker and the notebook and the lamp. She opened the box 3 nights later, on a Wednesday, after the last feeding and after she had checked Junie and Mr. Halloran one last time at the paddock gate. She sat at the kitchen table and untied the flour sack and lifted the lid. On top there was a folded piece of paper, brown at the edges, written in pencil in the same small even hand she had learned from him without knowing she was learning it. The note said, "Wren, if Ada has given you this box, then you have begun to do what I hoped someone in this family would do again before the knowledge went under the ground with me. There is a vein on this place that nobody has worked since my father stopped working it in 1958. He did not stop because it ran out. He stopped because the price of cattle went up and the price of patience went down. And he made a choice that I understood and did not agree with. I worked it a little when I was young, and I kept the records, which are under this letter, and I did not work it more because by the time I had the time, my back would not let me. And by the time my back would have let me with help, your father was gone, and there was no one to teach. The vein is not gold in the ground. The vein is the ground itself. Read the records. Walk the lines I have marked on the map. You will understand. Do not tell anyone what you find until you have proven it to yourself for one full season. After that, tell whoever you trust. The horses were how I hoped you would find your way back to this. I did not know it would be horses. I knew it would be something the rest of them had thrown away. Your grandfather. She read the note twice. She set it down. She lifted out the next layer, which was a stack of small ledger books bound in brown cloth, 6 of them, dated 1948 through 1957 in her great-grandfather's hand, and 1962 through 1971 in her grandfather's. Under the ledgers there was a folded map, hand-drawn on graph paper, of the 180 acres, with a pattern of lines and notations Wren did not immediately understand, but which corresponded, she saw after a moment of looking, to the pattern of the 4 small paddocks her grandfather had fenced behind the barn, and to several long strips of the upper hillside she had always assumed had been left wooded because the ground was too rough to clear. Under the map, there was a small cloth pouch. She opened the pouch. Inside the pouch there was a handful of soil, dark and crumbly and almost black, and a single dried stem of a grass she did not recognize, and a folded square of paper on which was written, in her grandfather's hand, "This is what comes up where the vein runs." She held the soil in her palm for a long time. Then she put everything back in the box in the order she had taken it out, and she closed the lid, and she sat at the table and did not move for almost an hour. The next morning she walked the lines on the map. She started at the back of the 4 small paddocks behind the barn, the ones whose pattern she had never fully understood, and she saw immediately that they were not laid out for grazing convenience. They were laid out along a curving strip of ground that ran from the limestone outcrop above the creek, around the shoulder of the hill, and up into the rough wooded section above the upper pasture. The strip was perhaps 40 feet wide at its narrowest and 100 feet wide at its widest, and it ran for nearly 3/4 of a mile when she traced it with her boots, and along its entire length, even in late October with most of the grass gone brown, the ground beneath her feet was different. It was softer. It was darker where the leaves had been kicked aside. The few stems still standing in the open places were the same grass that had been in the pouch, and they were the only places on the farm where that grass grew. She walked the whole length of it twice, once down and once back, and she sat on a limestone ledge at the top and ate the apple she had brought in her pocket and read the relevant pages of the 1953 ledger she had carried up with her. Her great-grandfather had written, in handwriting even smaller than her grandfather's, soil from the upper strip, half barrel, taken to the Anderson place for their tomato beds, returned 10 bushels of tomatoes in trade in August, the Andersons asking for double the soil next spring and offering to pay cash. He had written 2 weeks later, soil from the lower strip, full barrel, taken to the Whitley place for their tobacco starts, Whitley reporting his starts, the strongest he had ever said, asking for a stand-in arrangement. He had written, in November of the same year, 4 farms now asking for soil from the upper and lower strips, refusing all but the Andersons because cannot spare more without harming the ground. Wren closed the ledger. She looked out across the hollow in the long October light. She understood, finally, what her grandfather had meant when he had written that the vein was the ground itself. The narrow curving strip that wound from the creek to the ridge was a band of topsoil unlike any other soil on the farm or, as far as her great-grandfather's record suggested, on any farm for miles. And it had been laid down by something her great-grandfather had not tried to explain, and her grandfather had not tried to explain either. And it had been used briefly by the generation before hers, and then left alone for 65 years because cattle had been easier and the world had moved on. She walked back down the hill with the ledger under her arm and the pouch of soil in her pocket, and she did not tell anyone what she had found, because her grandfather had said to prove it to herself for one full season first, and she intended to do exactly that. She began the proving in the first week of November, in the smallest possible way. She filled 4 5-gallon buckets with soil taken from 4 different points along the strip, marked on the map, and she filled 4 more buckets from 4 points elsewhere on the farm as controls, and she set all 8 buckets in the shed behind the house under a tarp to overwinter. In late February, she planted the same seed in each bucket: 2 seeds of tomato, 2 seeds of pepper, 2 seeds of squash, and 1 stem of an heirloom basil. Her grandmother had been growing in her kitchen window for 30 years from a single mother plant. She put the buckets in the south window of the kitchen, and she watered them with the same water on the same schedule, and she watched. By the middle of March, every seed in the 4 vein soil buckets had germinated, and every seed had pushed a stem twice the height of its counterpart in the control buckets. By the 1st of April, the basil cuttings in the vein soil buckets were 3 times the size of the cuttings in the controls, and were producing leaves so dark and so fragrant that Ada, who came up for Sunday supper and saw them on the windowsill, stopped and bent over them and inhaled and said, "That is the basil he grew the year I married him, and I have not smelled that basil since 1962. Wren said, "The soil is from the strip behind the upper paddocks." Ada straightened up slowly and looked at her and said, "So you have read the box?" Wren said, "I have read the box." Ada said, "All right then." And she sat down at the table and ate her supper and did not say another word about the basil. But she took 2 cuttings home in a glass of water, and she planted them in a pot on her own windowsill, and she watched them grow through the spring, and she did not need to say anything more, because she had already said what she needed to say in 1962, when she had married a man whose family knew something about a piece of ground that nobody else knew, and she had waited 60 years to smell that basil again, and now she had. Wren did not stop with the horses. She did not stop with them because the horses had become the engine of the place, the thing that paid the bills and brought the people and built the reputation, and because she had given her word, in her own way, to the 26 new horses now on the place and to the ones who would come after them. But in the spring of the 3rd year, very quietly, in the same way she did everything, she began to work the strip. She did not plow it, because her grandfather's note and her great-grandfather's ledgers had both been clear that plowing the strip destroyed in one season what had taken centuries to lay down. She worked it the way her great-grandfather had worked it, in narrow beds dug by hand, no wider than a shovel and no deeper than the dark layer ran, with paths of untouched ground between them. She planted the basil her grandmother had given back to her, and tomatoes from seed she had saved from the windowsill plants, and peppers, and 3 rows of the old squash her grandfather had grown, and she sold nothing from the strip in the 1st year. She gave the produce away. She gave it to Ada, who fed it to her Sunday supper guests without telling them where it had come from, and watched their faces when they tasted the tomatoes. She gave it to Cole's mother, who put up 40 quarts of sauce from the tomatoes alone, and called Wren in October to tell her that her family had eaten that sauce all winter, and that her husband, who did not notice food, had noticed. She gave a basket to Eliza Crane when Eliza came up to look at a new gelding, and Eliza took a bite of one of the tomatoes standing at the back of her truck and stopped chewing and said, "What is this?" Wren said, "It's a tomato." Eliza said, "No, it isn't." Wren said, "It's a tomato from a particular piece of ground." Eliza said, "I want to buy whatever you grow on that piece of ground for the rest of my life, and I will pay whatever you ask, and I will not ask you any more questions about it than that." Wren said, "I'll let you know how it goes." That was what she said. It was the line she had been using on people since she was 19 years old, and it had not failed her yet. The first paying sale from the strip happened in the 2nd week of August of the 3rd year, and it was not to Eliza Crane, although Eliza was on the list. It was to a chef in Asheville who had been sent to Wren by the Asheville hippotherapy woman who had eaten one of Wren's tomatoes at a dinner at Eliza's house and had driven up the next weekend to find the source. The chef stood in the strip with Wren for an hour, and walked the length of it and bent down and put his hand on the ground, and stood up and said, "I have cooked in 4 countries, and I have not seen soil like this except once, in a valley in northern Italy, where a family has been growing the same 6 things on the same 2 acres for 400 years. Wren said, "My great-grandfather thought it was special." The chef said, "Your great-grandfather was correct. He bought everything she had picked that morning at a price she had not thought to ask for, and he placed a standing weekly order for the rest of the season, and he asked her before he left whether she would consider letting him bring 2 other chefs up to see the ground in the fall. Wren said, 1 at a time, and only if they understand they are not buying the ground." The chef said, "They will understand." He drove away with 3 flats of tomatoes and a bundle of basil in the passenger seat of a car that cost more than Wren's truck and her grandmother's house combined, and Wren walked back up to the barn and stood for a long time at the gate of the small paddock where Junie and Mr. Halloran were grazing in the late summer light, and she did not say anything to them, because there was nothing to say that they did not already know.